The Russian forces continued offensive operations on the eastern flank of Lyman, where they've managed to gain control over the central parts of Yampil, continuing offensive operations within the town, as well as the capture of the first patch area and the remaining fortifications on the eastern flank of the city itself, cutting off the highway that connects Lyman to Siversk to the southeast. With this, the Russians have also cut off the supplies that goes through to the fortifications to the southeast of Lyman, southwest of Yampil. All of these fortifications are now cut from the main supply line, where there are additional supply lines coming through the first patch area, where the Russian forces can now operate to cut those off as well. This complicates the situation for the remaining fortifications along the defensive line of the Ukrainians here in the Lyman section of the front line. At the same time, the Russians also managed to advance to the west of Zaporizhzhia, continuing the offensive operations along the first line and first patch areas along the first line of defense northeast of the city. The Russian forces are already operating within Lyman itself. These are mainly DRG units. With the capture of the first patch area, the main force is now on the outskirts of the city, and the battle of the city is intensifying from the eastern direction. As for the northwestern direction, the previous days have seen advances by the Russians along the supply lines as they further complicate the supply of Lyman from the western direction. With this, we're seeing that the Russians are focusing on the flanks of Lyman rather than the city itself, but at the same time, they're also storming the city itself from the eastern direction. Heavy fighting continues not just within Lyman, but also on the fortifications and the flanks. The Russian advance within Yampil continues in the direction of the southern parts, where they're looking to gain full control over the town, which will then reach the highway here to the south of Yampil, where the Russians can start offensive operations to combine the forces between the Siversk and Lyman section of the front line, where they've already been pushing in the direction of Toretsk, gaining control over that settlement, gaining control over the railway bridge. With the push in the Yampil direction, the Russians can combine their forces along the main bridge, which isn't just the railway one, but also the secondary one. This will allow the Russians to use Yampil as a logistical hub for forces operating on the eastern bank of the Siversk river line on the western flank of Siversk to continue offensive operations south of the Siversk river. On the southern flank of Siversk, the Russians have managed to gain control over the fortifications, which is the second group fortification south of Siversk. The first one was the northwest of Myrnohrad, which the Russians captured a couple of months back. With this, the Russians have now pushed to the next fortifications, gaining control over that, which leaves the final fortifications, which is on the southern outskirts of the town. The Russians continued offensive operations along the railway line, and with the capture of the fortifications, they now have control over the high ground, which overlooks the final fortifications in between Vovchansk and Setphnohirsk, while fighting continues on the southern outskirts of the town. So with this, the Russians are developing offensive operations along the southern flank of Siversk to redirect the Ukrainian defensive forces from not just the northern flank and eastern flanks, but also the southern flank, while they continued offensive operations on the northern bank of the Siversk river line and north of Siversk. In the northern section of the front line in direction of Vovchansk, the Russians have managed to gain control over Setphnohirsk, the entirety of the town, and reach the outskirts of Zahelne. At the same time, they continue offensive operations west of the forest patch area in the direction of Prilipka, where they're looking to gain control over the river crossing and settlement here along the forest patch area, allowing for additional supply lines into the southern bank of the Kostiantynivka and Toretsk river lines. The capture of Setphnohirsk secures the southern flank of the forest patch area and the residential area, allowing the Russian forces to entrench themselves within the town, and we push towards Zahelne, covers the southern flank of Vovchansk, where they're looking to push in the direction of Vilchia to gain control over the residential area here along the railway line to the southwest of Vovchansk, covering the southern flank and western flank of the town as they consider offensive operations within it and along the railway line itself. The Russians managed to gain control over additional parts of the southern parts of Vovchansk, where they consider the offensive operations to gain full control over the town. This advance is along the railway line, where they're looking to gain full control over the railway station, allowing them to secure the southwestern flank of Vovchansk and concentrate the Ukrainian forces towards the highway area, gaining control over which will cut off the main supply route for the Ukrainian forces operating within the town, and allow the Russians to continue offensive operations in the southern parts of the Vovchansk river line and Vovchansk itself to gain full control over the town, and push alongside the Vovchansk river line to gain control over both banks of it, here along the border between the Belgorod and Kharkiv regions. In the eastern parts of the Donetsk region, the Russians continued offensive operations within Kostiantynivka, where the DRG units continue operating within the residential area in the rear of the fortifications on the eastern outskirts of the city. This geolocated footage confirms the Russian presence within the eastern parts, in addition to the previously geolocated footage showing their forces in the central parts. So with this, the Russian forces have an entry point into Kostyantynivka from the eastern flank through the Dacha area, where the DRG units are operating within the city, expanding the zone of control and preparing for the main force to enter, and also to cut off the supplies leading to the fortifications on the eastern outskirts, clearing the road through the T0504 highway towards the eastern parts of the city. The Russians continued offensive operations towards the city itself, operating within it and clearing the way for the main forces, similar to what happened in Pokrovsk prior to the main forces entering into the city. DRG units were already operating in the central parts of it. To the south of it, in the Klebenbyk direction, the Russians have gained control over the south of the reservoir, fully securing the area from Ukrainian forces which were operating within it, mainly supplied through Ukrainian drones flying over the reservoir area. So with this, the Russians have completely secured the southern bank of the reservoir and the southern flank of Kostyantynivka, allowing them to redirect their forces in the direction of Ivanopilia and up towards Kostyantynivka from the southeast, in addition to the fighting along the fortifications to the southwest of Kostyantynivka and the western flank of the city. Therefore, we can expect more offensive operations by the Russians to the south, southwest, and east of Kostyantynivka. As for the Zaporizhzhia direction, there's been some positional fighting with no decisive movement, but as the fighting comes closer and closer to Kostyantynivka, it becomes more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to defend their flanks. The eastern and northern flank of Kostyantynivka is the most prioritized area for Ukrainian forces operating in this section of the front line, as it is the high ground that overlooks the city, while the southern and southwestern, as well as the southeastern directions, are less prioritized, because the Ukrainians can still counterattack in those directions, where if they lose the northern and northeastern flank, it becomes much more difficult in comparison. Speaking of Ukrainian counterattacks, the Ukrainians continued offensive operations on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, where they managed to regain control over two of these quarries, which overlooks the northern flank of Pankivka and Mayak. This complicates the supply to the Russian forces operating here in the northwest of Shahova, which puts additional pressure on the Russian forces storming the town. Speaking of the forces storming the town, the Ukrainian deep state map released a video showing dozens of vehicles driving towards the town from the eastern flank, but Russians are launching a mechanized assault to drop off the infantry towards Shahova, where some of the vehicles managed to reach the areas. According to Deep State Map, about half of them were damaged or destroyed, but according to the footage itself, we only saw approximately 4 vehicles being damaged or destroyed. We're seeing that the Russians are launching larger mechanized assaults here in the northern flank of Pokrovsk to counterattack the Ukrainian counterattack, so we're going to be seeing major fights taking place on the northern flank of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, where both the Russians and the Ukrainians are out in the open, and mainly FPV drones will be striking each other's positions. But once these forces meet and clash, that's where the bloodiest battles take place. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians have special forces operating in the Pokrovsk, Myrnograd, and Rodinsk area, where they are fighting each other. There's also the SBU of the Ukrainians operating drones in the area, where they're mainly targeting supply lines and the rear trucks that are moving to supply the forces. So this makes it extremely complicated for either side to launch any successful assaults, as the best of both sides are fighting in the area. But at the same time, we're also seeing that the large concentration of forces allows them to make some advances, even if the assaults are complicated and costly, because they always have reserves. So heavy fighting is taking place here in the northern flank, where the Ukrainians and the Russians are throwing some of their best forces to end this decisive battle that overlooks Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, as whoever comes out on top, depending on the time frame, can have significant impact on the fighting taking place within Myrnograd and Pokrovsk. Not to mention, the Russian capture of Rodinsk is not easy to undo, as the Russians now have full control over the city, which had a pre-war population of over 10,000 people. It is not a small town that the Ukrainians can recapture in a day. without a Russian withdrawal from it, and the Russians are unlikely to withdraw from it due to the importance of it overlooking the supply lines in and out of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk. The Russians are here looking to gain control over Pokrovsk to control the highway leading through Pokrovsk up towards Rodinsk, where they can significantly strengthen the supplies of the forces operating north of the cities of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, and significantly strengthen defensive operations in the direction of Belitske and onwards towards Dobropilya, cutting off the logistical hub supplying the Ukrainian forces operating north of the cities. The Russians are speeding up the offensive operations within Myrnohrad, where they are now storming the eastern apartment complex area of Myrnohrad. As we see with this located footage, the Russians reached the outskirts of the apartment complex area, where they started storming them. With this, the Russians are working on the apartment complex area in the eastern parts of the northern section of Myrnohrad. They've reached the apartment complex area in the southern parts, in the area between the southern and northern parts, the central section, and they are fighting over the industrial area and residential area in the southern parts as well. The Russians are fighting over all of the important parts except for the northwestern outskirts of Myrnohrad, which includes additional industrial and apartment complex areas. The easternmost, most important defensive positions of the Ukrainians are all being attacked by the Russian forces. To the southwest of this, the Russians continue offensive operations within the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. To the west of Setphnohirsk, the Russians have managed to recapture the settlement and regain control over some of the fortifications, pushing the Ukrainians away from it and pushing them back towards the Vovchansk river line. The Ukrainians managed to recapture Myrnohrad, but with the recapture of Setphnohirsk, the Russians have secured the southern flank of the settlement and may be able to regain control over Myrnohrad by recapturing the positions in the south, freeing up their forces to then counterattack in the north. But the Ukrainians still have to cross over the Vovchansk river line to resupply their own forces and send reinforcements. To the southwest of this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the vicinity of Verbove in the direction of Novoalexandrivka, gaining control over the fortifications and reaching the eastern outskirts of Vishneve. To the southwest of this, the Russians managed to gain control over additional forest lines to the south of Yehorivka, securing the flank of the settlement. This is to expand their zone of control on the western bank of the Yanchur River, where they continue offensive operations to expand their bridgehead across and strengthen defensive operations on the western bank, where they are looking to expand the zone of control to cut off the highway north of Lyman. To the east of this, the Russians managed to advance further towards Krasnohirsk, where they are putting pressure on the remaining Ukrainian forces east of the Yanchur river line. This is the final settlement under Ukrainian control in the area. Further south in the western flank of Poltavka, the Russians continue offensive operations along the southern parts of the first line of defense here in the Zaporizhzhia region, where they are lining the front line in the western direction to gain control over Veselis, Lenihai, and Vysoke, as well as the southern flank of the fortifications. But when they fight over the northern flank of them, they'll be able to push through the fortifications and connect their forces between the north and the south. The fighting is now centered around the settlements here to the south of the first offensive line, along the Yanchur river line, and towards the highway in the western direction. In the western outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region along the Dnieper River, the Russians continued offensive operations within Setphnohirsk, bypassing the settlement entirely along the river line itself, where they are infiltrating deep into the Dacha area. The Russians are here going beyond the first line of defense in the Zaporizhzhia region and expanding the zone of control within the Dacha area to outflank the Ukrainian forces counterattacking in the Setphnohirsk direction. This is a risky maneuver because the Ukrainians can counterattack from the eastern flank and cut off the supplies to the Russian forces operating further north. However, if the Russians are able to succeed with this, cut off the connection here in the north and secure the eastern flank as well, they'll be able to gain control over the flank of the first defensive line, gaining a foothold across through the E105 highway, which leads up towards Zaporizhzhia city itself. The Russian offensive operations here is to outflank the first offensive line from the western direction and launch offensive operations on the flank of it and gain control over the first offensive line from the western direction, similar to the operations in the east. The objective is to meet in the middle in the direction of Oryhiv by capturing the fortifications in the western and eastern flanks. The Russian objective is to gain control over the western flank at the same time as they gain control over Huliepole, the second defensive line, to then meet in the middle in the direction of Oryhiv and then combine their forces on the second flank, the second defensive line here in the Zaporizhzhia region, to connect their forces between Oryhiv and Omelnik allowing for additional crossings across the first and second lines of defense, and continue developing defensive operations here in the flank of the fortifications, completely bypassing the defensive lines of the Ukrainians, which have held back the Russians for the past 3 years. In conclusion, significant battles take place all across the front line, from the Zaporizhzhia region in the south to the Kharkiv region in the north, mainly centered around the Donetsk region, but also around Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia. There's also some rumors of the Russians launching offensive operations towards the city of Kherson itself across the Dnieper River line, where DRG units are operating within some of the islands and the residential areas in the southern outskirts of Kherson, but until confirmed information comes out, we'll leave that for a later time. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.